Greetings Exiles, BullShifter here, and today I'm going to be covering how to go ahead and gear up, or preparing to gear up, to hit your mid to late game push. Now, what you may have noticed once you get to around the mid game is that your item stats are becoming a bit more important. When you first start off the game, you're usually only worrying about your socket colors and links, so that way you can start to level up your skill gems and make your skill gems effective. But the further you push into the game, the more you're going to need to stack certain affixes that match up with your build in order to gain maximum functionality of your build itself. Now there's a few ways of doing this. First off is the most standard way, which is actually going through the game and looting the items that monsters drop. Now there are a few things that you want to go ahead and keep in mind with those drops, as they will mostly show up as unidentified items, and this is actually going to apply to the other ways to gear up as well. So the biggest one is going to be what the base type of the item is, or the base stat of the item is. Now if we look through here, let's use these gauntlets as an example. So the base attribute for this is armor. Armor always ties into strength, which is going to tie into red skill gems. Now the reason why that's important is essentially it means that, one, it's going to help me stack up my armor. So if I'm looking for a build that has a high percentage of armor, this is going to be good for that build. Another reason why it's important is a straight armor item is going to have the highest probability to roll red sockets. Now similarly, if you have an energy shield armor, or energy shield piece of gear, and let's just say this didn't have armor on it. Let's say it was pure energy shield. That relates to intelligence, which relates to blue gems. And there is also evasion rating, which by process of elimination ties into your dexterity, which ties into green gems. So the reason why that's important first and foremost is the fact that if you are trying to roll certain colored skill gems onto your items themselves for your build, for your skill and support gems, you're going to want an item, base that's actually going to help you along with getting the correct colored sockets. So say for this item, I have armor and evasion rating. So I have the highest probability of green and red sockets. So for argument's sake, if I was trying to get blue sockets onto this item, this would be a waste of time. I'm going to dump a bunch of resources into it, and if it's one where I need, 4 blue sockets, I'm probably never going to hit 4 blue sockets. Now there are ways that you can go to your crafting bench and craft specific colored sockets onto your item, a specific amount of linked sockets, and a specific amount of sockets. However, it does take a decent amount of resources, and there's still some RNG involved because say I craft 2 red sockets onto an item, and it's a 4 socket item. Those other 2 sockets could still roll any color. They could be 2 reds, a blue, and a green, 2 reds, 2 blues. It could even be 3 reds and a green. So there is still some RNG involved with that. So the best way to kind of cheat your way past that is by making sure that it has the base stat that gives you the highest probability to roll the colored skill gem sockets that you need. Now, obviously with them all being tied to a defensive stat, the other thing that these are important for is actually building the defensive stat that you want. So if you're building a build that has a lot of energy shield, you're going to want a lot of intelligence-based items to help you stack up your energy shield higher and higher and higher. The same would go for armor, and the same for evasion rating. Now, I do think it's more important to make sure that you have the items that will help you roll the correct sockets. So with this character in particular, I'm pretty much building armor. I'm not as worried about evasion or energy shield. However, I do have a small amount of both on this character, simply because it was just necessary for the gem sockets that I needed. So do keep that in mind, that your gem sockets in most instances are going to take a little bit of priority over that stacking, simply because of the fact that there will be attributes and nodes in your passive skill tree that you can use to make up for the fact that maybe you don't have quite as much armor or quite as much energy shield as you wanted because you had an item that the skill gems just didn't match what you were looking for on your actual base attribute. Now, with that said, once you loot items out in the wild, when they're dropping from monsters, most of them are going to show up as unidentified. So if you're going by the base stat on the item, which you can always see before you identify the item, you can actually save yourself a bit of time in not identifying items that aren't going to match your build. So items that you either aren't going to be able to roll the correct gem colors on, or items that just don't give you the defensive base stat that you're looking for. So when you do identify those items, typically there's going to be about 2 to 3, maybe 4 stats that you're absolutely looking for on an item specifically. For a lot of your actual defensive gear, typically you're going to be looking to stack your resistances there, you're going to be looking for life there, and you're going to be looking to build that other defensive layering stat that you're looking to build, whether it's energy shield, evasion, armor, or a combination of 2 of the 3. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean in order to get the perfect item that you need to get all of those stats onto your item. As a matter of fact, if you're short one of those items, that may even be better, simply because of the fact that you can go to your crafting bench and craft on one more modifier by default. Now, that's not going to be the case if you have 3 suffix and 3 prefix modifiers on your item already. That will make it so you cannot actually craft another modifier on it. You can also not craft modifiers onto unique items, but there are some very slight exceptions. I should say there's one exception. You can corrupt an item to change an item, but you also take the risk of potentially rendering that item completely useless. So corrupting an item isn't necessarily always the best route to go with things. With that said, let's get into what a prefix and what a suffix modifier is. So if you hold down the left stick, you can actually see what's labeled as a prefix modifier and what's labeled as a suffix modifier. Now, typically your prefix modifiers are going to consist of things like your life, your mana, your one of your base defensive stats like your energy, shield, armor, or evasion, and your suffixes are usually going to consist of your resistances and your base attributes such as intelligence, dexterity, and strength. Now, there are quite a few more, and the more you familiarize yourself with these, the more useful it's going to be down the road, because when you pick up an item, you're going to know right off the bat exactly what type of modifier you can craft onto that item to make it that much better. Let's use this chest piece for an example. As you can see, it's slightly lighter at the bottom. The plus 27% to lightning resistance is something that I actually crafted on. And when I pull up the stats for it, I can see that by seeing that I have a master crafted suffix modifier on this item. That just means that it's something that I personally master crafted onto the item itself. Now, when I first picked this item up, it had 2 prefix modifiers and 2 suffix modifiers, which means that for this particular item, I actually had a lot of crafting freedom. I could craft essentially anything that wasn't already on this item. So let's unequip this and take it to the crafting bench, and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about. So if we move this item over, we're going to see that for the most part, all of these modifiers that are still this whitish yellow color, these are all modifiers I can still craft onto this item. Now, maximum life is red. I can't craft that onto it, and if you notice right above it, it says this item already has a mod of this type. And you can see on the item itself, I have plus 45 to maximum life. So I can't craft the modifier that's already on the item. Now, for some of you who are a bit more vigilant, you may have noticed, but wait, stun and block recovery is on there. Or, well, since we're in the prefixes, let's just go this way. Armor and evasion's already on there, but it's still allowing you to craft increased armor and evasion onto the item. Why is that? Well, if I hold the left stick down, I can actually see that in this particular case, increased armor and evasion and increased stun and block recovery are actually grouped together as one modifier. So that counts as its own modifier, meaning that armor and evasion by itself is not a modifier on this item, so I can actually still craft it on there. Another great example here is I can't craft straight fire resistance onto this item. However, I can go down and I can still put more fire resistance on this item by putting fire and cold resist on, or fire and lightning resist. So I can put a combination resist on here, but I can't put more straight fire resistance on the item itself. So that's also things to keep in mind when it comes to master crafting your items. So the big thing that I needed on this item when I was upgrading it from my previous item was I needed more maximum life. I needed to stay around the same amount of fire resistance and lightning resistance. Those were my focuses. So as you can see, I ended up getting a little bit increased life on here, and I had the fire resistance I needed, but unfortunately I didn't have the lightning resist. But because I knew resistances were a suffix modifier, and I had an open spot to craft a suffix modifier, I could go ahead and actually put that lightning resistance onto this item, therefore making it better than the item that I currently had equipped and making this chest piece usable. So those are all things to keep in mind when you're actually going out and looting your items to try and make your build that much better, is if you are missing a modifier, you can potentially craft it on there and still get a better item than what you currently have equipped. Now there are two other methods for getting items as you level up. One would be going through the trade market, which is relatively self-explanatory. You can go ahead and search the exact type of item, so say we were looking for gloves. And then the nice thing here is, in our categories, we can actually see what the base attributes are here. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, we can actually grab items that will benefit the type of gem sockets that we're looking for, so we can get the correct colors, and we can go ahead and get the correct defensive base types. Now, some of these items will also have what's known as an implicit modifier. Gloves aren't exactly the best example, so the best example to look at implicit modifiers with is rings, because just about every ring in the game has some sort of implicit modifier. So let's go to a gold ring, for example. Increased rarity of items found. That's going to be on every single gold ring that you find. Go to amethyst ring, and it's going to be chaos resistance. And you'll also grow accustomed to these over time, so that way you'll actually know if you want a little bit of, a specific boosted stat, you can get it as an implicit modifier. Now the great thing about implicit modifiers is, one, it doesn't count against your modifier count. So it doesn't count as a prefix or a suffix modifier on your item, which means another thing. So for example, this item has increased elemental damage. And this applies for any implicit. I'm just using this as an example. Say it had increased fire damage, or increased, fire damage or increased fire resistance. I can craft that same modifier when master crafting onto this item. An implicit modifier, since it doesn't count as a suffix or a prefix modifier, it also doesn't count when you're master crafting. So I can craft elemental damage onto this if I have that unlocked. I can craft fire resistance on a ring that has an implicit of fire resistance, as long as it doesn't already have that suffix modifier attached to it as well. So those are things to keep in mind when you first start using the trade market. Another is obviously the fact that you can hit left stick and the left D-pad and search for specific terms for items you need as well. You can search a few different specific terms, so it helps you actually whittle down exactly the item you're looking for. So if we're looking for a new belt, say we're looking at a heavy belt, because we know that heavy belts have the implicit of more strength, and we want something that's going to give us life, and we'll say physical damage. And if we go ahead and actually put quotations around our terms, we can actually get an exact search for those terms. So we can scroll through here, and it's actually going to only highlight items that have strength and physical damage added to them. So it helps us whittle down exactly what we're trying to buy from the shop. Another thing to keep in mind, if an item is corrupted, or if it's a unique, you cannot craft any sort of modifiers on those. So just be careful of that as well. So that pretty much covers gaining your items through the trade market. The other way to gain items would be through crafting onto base items. Now, a base item is just any sort of white item. There's a couple ways to get them. You can loot them just off of monster drops, which are going to be a bit more common early on to get white items, but they'll also show up later on. If you have a loot filter equipped, you may have to hit L3 when you're running through a map in order to actually see those drops, because you're probably filtering them out. Otherwise, you can go to most NPCs in town, and typically they're all tied to a certain shop. So we can actually buy most base armor and weapon items here. So if we were to go ahead, and obviously it's just like looting an item, it'll actually show you the base stats. Obviously we can see the color of sockets and the links that are there already. But essentially, once you go ahead and get a white base item, you can use your currency to actually craft. So there's a few that are useful in general. If you've been delving, you can actually slot fossils into what's known as a resonator. And as you can see on here, it will actually give us more specific modifiers that we can get. So if we had slotted this into, say, a one slot resonator, which is a resonator that holds one fossil, we would in turn get more life modifiers, but we'd be guaranteed to not get any armor, energy shield, or evasion modifiers onto the item that we're upgrading from white to gold. Now, some resonators will actually allow for you to place more than one fossil, so you actually have a bit more control of the customization that way. Now, another more random way of crafting is through essences. These also have to be used on white base items, but it'll actually guarantee you one stat when you're moving your white item to a gold rare item. So this one, for example, if we used it on a one-handed weapon, it would roll anywhere between 15 and 18% increased damage on that weapon, and the other modifiers would be random. Now, the other way to craft is a bit more involved. One thing that we can do is we can use a straight Orb of Alchemy, upgrade it from a normal item to a rare item directly, and get completely random rolls onto that item. If we don't like the rolls we get for any specific form of crafting, we can always use an Orb of Scouring on it, remove all the modifiers from the item, and start from a white base item all over again. This can in particular be useful if you find an item with a really good implicit that you like, but the other stats on it aren't very good. It gives you an opportunity to go ahead and recraft those stats on. Another way to give you a bit more control of what you're getting is to upgrade it from a white to a blue, and then a blue to a gold. And you can do that originally by using an Orb of Transmutation on an item, which will upgrade it from a normal to a magic with one or two modifiers on it already. So that way you can essentially craft to, two modifiers at first until you get a couple that you really like. So say we use this on an item and we don't like the modifiers on it. If it only has one and it's actually a modifier we don't mind, we can always go ahead and use an Orb of Augmentation and add one more modifier to it. If we don't like any of them, we can use an Orb of Alteration and completely re-roll that magic item with brand new modifiers. We can also use an Orb of Chance to upgrade it to a random rarity, which will also give us an opportunity to turn a white item into a unique. However, this is the most common way of doing it. So basically the idea is for you to craft two modifiers that you really like onto the item, and then use a Regal Orb to craft that blue item up to a gold item. So that way, you essentially are guaranteed the two modifiers that you really, really like onto that item, and then hopefully once you craft it up to a gold item, you'll get more modifiers that will help you out as well. So that kind of brings up the question of, do I purchase something on the marketplace or do I start crafting? And my answer to that would be, typically, if you're in the mid-game and you haven't started mapping yet, usually you're going to be better off just buying things from the marketplace as long as you're not looking for a super expensive item. Simply because if I'm spending, one or two Chaos Orbs on an item, it's usually going to be less of a price than the amount of orbs I'm going to spend on crafting the actual item that I need. If you're in endgame and you have plenty of different crafting materials, it does give you an opportunity to go ahead and craft gear on your own that may potentially be less expensive, because obviously endgame gear is going to be a lot more expensive, a lot more chaos, and even sometimes an exalted orb or more. And you have the opportunity of being able to craft for a lot cheaper than that, or potentially crafting a really great item and selling it for even more down the road. So those are essentially the three different ways you can go ahead and gear up and prepare yourself for endgame and for later game mapping. I hope you find this guide useful. As always, if you have any questions whatsoever, or if there's anything that I missed, definitely pop into the comment section below, and I will try and answer as quickly as I possibly can. Otherwise, I do hope you find this helpful and hope you can implement this into your game to help you push mid and end game much, much easier. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, may the RNG be with you, always.